What exactly is wrong with Lori Vallow Daybell? So we are actually going to go through the clinical diagnosis of what the hell is going on in the mind of Lori Vallow Daybell as best as we can understand it. She talked about near-death experiences, how her kids were communicating with her from beyond.
Lori Vallow Daybell has gone insane. That is where we begin today. Not with the investigation, not with the arrests, not with the verdicts. We begin with that sentence. Because that sentence tells you more about who Lori Vallow Daybell is than anything else that came before or after it. In February 2023, a psychiatric evaluation determined that Lori Vallow Daybell suffers from 3 overlapping conditions: a delusional disorder, hyper-religiosity, and an unspecified personality disorder with narcissistic features. That evaluation was confirmed by the sentencing judge in Idaho and reported by Newsweek, Fox News, CBS News, and the Associated Press. 3 diagnoses, 1 woman, and a trail of destruction that stretched across 2 states, multiple years, and multiple lives. Here is what this documentary is going to do. We are going to take those 3 diagnoses apart, one by one, and hold them up against the documented record, against the text messages admitted into evidence, against the court testimony, against her own words. Because there is a version of this story where the diagnosis explains everything, and there is a version where it explains almost nothing. By the time we are finished, you will know which one is closer to the truth. Before we go any further, hit subscribe right now and tap the notification bell so you never miss a release from Crimes Revealed. Drop in the comments where you are watching from tonight. This community has grown into something genuinely remarkable, and every single person in it matters. Let us know you are here. We are just getting started. Lori Vallow Daybell was a mother, a woman who had been married 5 times, and by every outward measure, someone living an ordinary life across Arizona and Idaho. In May 2023, a jury in Fremont County, Idaho, found her guilty of the killings of her 2 youngest children and conspiracy in the death of her then-husband's former wife. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her husband, Chad Daybell, stood trial separately. In May 2024, he was convicted on all counts. On June 1, 2024, he was sentenced to death. 2 trials, 2 convictions, 1 shared belief system at the center of both. In February 2023, a psychiatric evaluation assigned her 3 overlapping diagnoses. And this is where the record becomes complicated. Because the woman described in that psychiatric report, and the woman whose conduct was documented across 2 years of investigation, 2 complete trials, and hundreds of pieces of admitted evidence, those 2 portraits do not fully align. Each diagnosis will be examined one at a time, and the record will show exactly where the official account starts to fracture. The first diagnosis is delusional disorder. A delusion, by clinical definition, is a fixed and false belief that a person continues to hold even when clear and overwhelming evidence says otherwise. The person does not waver, does not negotiate, does not adjust the account based on who is in the room or what is at stake. They hold the belief completely, and no amount of external pressure moves them from it. That is the clinical standard. Here is what the documented record actually shows. Prosecutors presented text messages, recorded phone calls, and emails that established Lori and Chad had built an entire internal system of language around their shared beliefs. They assigned what they called death percentages to people in their lives. They placed individuals into categories: light souls and dark souls. They communicated in language specific to their framework. They referred to people close to them as spiritually compromised, taken over by what they described as dark forces. This was not casual conversation. This was a structured, consistent system they developed together and applied over a period of years. And yet, at her sentencing in July 2023, when Lori Vallow Daybell spoke publicly for the first time since her arrest in 2020, she did not stand by any of it. She told the court the media had distorted everything, that what had been reported about her beliefs was exaggeration, that the picture prosecutors painted did not reflect who she was or what she had believed. The text said otherwise. The recorded calls said otherwise. The emails said otherwise. Then came October 2024. a recorded phone call between Lori and her oldest son Colby Ryan was released to the public. In that call, she offered an entirely new account of what had happened to her children. She was calm, she was detailed, she was composed, and the version she presented to Colby bore no resemblance to what the evidence had already confirmed inside a courtroom. Her own defense team, ahead of the Idaho trial, filed documents stating that Lori Vallow Daybell would not be using her mental illness diagnosis during the guilt phase of the proceedings. The reason stated was direct. She believed she would be acquitted. She expected to walk out of that courtroom a free woman. Consider that carefully. A person in the full grip of clinical delusion does not build a legal strategy around expected acquittal. A person who has genuinely lost their connection to what is real does not instruct attorneys to hold a psychiatric diagnosis in reserve for a penalty phase she did not believe would ever arrive. That is not the conduct of someone who cannot tell the difference between what is true and what is not. That is the conduct of someone who knows exactly what the truth is, and has made a considered decision about how much of it to show and when. There is a concept in psychology that is worth understanding here. When the mind is placed under sustained pressure, it will sometimes construct a protective barrier between a person and a reality they are not prepared to face. When a version of events is repeated with enough consistency, enough detail, and enough emotional investment, the brain eventually stops processing it as false. It becomes the working version of what happened, not because the person has lost touch with reality, but because the mind has done what it is built to do. It protected the person inside it. That is a condition, but it is a very different condition from clinical delusion. Clinical delusion does not adapt. It does not lead a person to flee across state lines while investigators are looking for missing children. It does not produce a different version of events for every different person asking questions. It does not dissolve the moment cameras appear and a sentencing hearing begins. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell left for Hawaii while investigators were actively working to locate her children. She gave different accounts of the children's whereabouts to different people. She shifted her story as circumstances changed around her. And when the full weight of the legal process closed in, she did not stand in that courtroom and declare her mission. She said the media had gotten the story wrong. Genuine conviction does not operate that way. People who have held to beliefs they truly lived by have, across history, accepted the consequences without revision. They have not entered strategic plea decisions and waited for a jury. The delusion at the center of this diagnosis, if that word even applies correctly, is not a fracture. It is a structure. It was built deliberately, reinforced over time, and maintained with enough internal consistency to eventually feel indistinguishable from memory. But feeling true is not the same as being true. And knowing the difference between those two things, that precise and documented distinction, is exactly what the psychiatric evaluation alone cannot fully resolve. Millions of people hold deep and sincere religious faith. That faith anchors them. It shapes how they see the world, how they raise children, how they move through difficulty. What was documented in this case is something different from that. Hyper-religiosity is what happens when belief separates entirely from reality and becomes a mechanism, a framework, a justification, a structure that serves purposes beyond faith itself. That is what the evidence in this case established. To understand how Lori Vallow Daybell arrived at the belief system prosecutors laid out across 2 trials, the starting point has to be where that system actually came from. Because it did not come from any single religious tradition, any single text, or any established doctrine. What Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow constructed together was a belief system assembled from pieces: LDS fringe theology, apocalyptic literature, personal revelation, and a private mythology they built and refined across several years. Investigators and prosecutors described it as a patchwork, a framework assembled not from inherited tradition, but from selected ideas chosen to serve a specific purpose. Chad Daybell had been publishing apocalyptic and religious fiction through a company called Spring Creek Book Company for years before he and Lori ever crossed paths. His books centered on end-time scenarios, spiritual conflict, and the premise that certain individuals were chosen to lead others through a coming period of global collapse. He had built a platform around these ideas. He had built an audience, and over time, he had built an identity as someone who held special spiritual knowledge. By the time he and Lori connected, that identity was already established and fully formed. According to testimony at trial, Chad introduced Lori to a framework in which every person could be assessed by the condition of their soul. Some individuals, within this system, carried light. Others had been overtaken by darkness, no longer fully themselves. Chad positioned himself as the sole authority capable of determining which category any given person occupied. He gave this assessment a name. He called it reading a person's death percentage. That phrase entered the court record. Chad Daybell claimed the ability to evaluate how close any individual was to spiritual or physical decline. He applied this framework to people in their immediate circle. He applied it to people who would later lose their lives. He also presented himself as the leader of a group he called the Church of the Firstborn, a name drawn from early LDS theological language but used, in practice, as a title for a private system of authority, with Chad at its center. In 2021, a probable cause affidavit filed by the Chandler Police Department in Arizona documented what investigators had established about Lori's position within this framework. According to that affidavit, Lori Vallow Daybell believed she was an exalted goddess. She and Chad, according to the shared belief system their communications documented, had been chosen to lead 144,000 people through the final days before a global collapse. The number 144,000 appears in the Book of Revelation. They placed themselves at the front of it. This was not a private passing thought. It was documented across communications, confirmed by multiple witnesses who testified at trial, and supported by a law enforcement affidavit filed years before the Idaho proceedings began. Now consider what was happening in both their personal lives at the same moment this system was being built and reinforced. In the summer of 2019, both Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were still legally married to other people. Chad was married to Tammy Daybell. Lori was married to Charles Vallow, her fourth husband. By that point, the two had developed a relationship that had moved well beyond the podcast appearances and spiritual gatherings where they first encountered each other. During Chad Daybell's 2024 trial, prosecutors introduced text messages the two had exchanged during this period. Those messages were admitted into evidence and covered in detail by CBS News and multiple Idaho news organizations throughout the proceedings. In one of those messages, Chad described to Lori how he saw himself. He compared his situation to that of a young person of extraordinary but unrecognized destiny, forced to live among people who could not understand what he truly was. He described his home life as a kind of confinement. He called Lori his goddess. He described the time they managed to spend together as something set apart from ordinary life, and then he wrote that he could sense permanent freedom approaching. That message was sent while Tammy Daybell was alive. A man who had positioned himself as a spiritually appointed leader, someone with the authority to assess the soul condition of the people around him, was writing privately about feeling trapped, wanting escape, and expecting that freedom was on its way. That is not a divine calling. That is a person who wanted a different life and built a belief system wide enough to justify the path toward it. Understanding why Lori absorbed this framework as completely as she did requires looking at what she already carried before Chad arrived. Witness testimony at trial and accounts from people who knew her across different periods of her life described a woman who had long believed she occupied a different level of spiritual understanding than the people around her. She spoke about direct access to revelation. She described herself as operating beyond what ordinary faith could offer. She told people the Bible was a meaningful text, but one she had personally moved past. Chad did not introduce those beliefs into Lori. What he did was arrive with a theological vocabulary that gave those beliefs a structure, a scale, and a defined purpose. He confirmed what she had already concluded about herself. He gave her a specific role, not simply a person of faith, but a leader, not a follower, but a central figure in an unfolding mission, and she accepted it. She gave him something equally significant in return. She gave him a witness who believed his account of himself without question. She reflected his self-constructed identity back to him completely. Two people who each carried a version of themselves they needed the world to validate, and found in each other exactly the validation they were searching for. That was not coincidence. That was the foundation of everything that followed. The third diagnosis in the February 2023 evaluation is narcissistic features. Of the three conditions identified in that report, this is the one that requires the least clinical language to recognize, because it does not only appear in courtrooms and legal documents, it appears in ordinary exchanges, in the gap between what one person says and what another person chooses to hear. Grandiosity is the clinical term for what the evaluation identified. In practical terms, it describes a condition where a person's internal assessment of their own significance has expanded past the point where the standard rules of social exchange apply. Criticism does not register. The needs and reality of other people occupy a lower level of importance than their own. Lori Vallow Daybell made this visible in statements she gave to people across multiple years. She told people plainly, not in private, but openly, that while the Bible held meaning for others, she had personally arrived at a level of knowledge and access to revelation that went beyond it. In her own accounting of herself, she had surpassed the text that most of her religious community treated as the highest authority. That position did not form in isolation. It was reinforced consistently by Chad Daybell's private communications with her. His admitted text messages addressed her as a goddess. His entire framework placed her at the center of a world-level mission. The language he used in every communication elevated her above the ordinary, and she received all of it. He needed her to hold that belief about herself. She needed someone to confirm it. That mutual exchange was the structural foundation of their relationship. This same pattern shows up at a much smaller scale, in the kind of moment that never makes a court filing, but tells you everything about how a person actually moves through the world. Colby Ryan, Lori's oldest son, has spoken publicly about the experience of growing up in a home shaped by his mother's ways of thinking and responding. What he and others who knew her over the years described was a pattern in which ordinary communication carried a cost that was difficult to predict. A reasonable boundary would be received as a personal attack. A straightforward request would return transformed into something the original speaker had never said or intended. A simple, logical statement could become evidence of a fundamental betrayal, one that existed entirely within her interpretation of it. That is how narcissistic features function in everyday life. Not in visible public moments, in the space between what is said and what is processed. In the response of a person who believes themselves to be of singular importance when the world around them does not organize itself according to that importance. The entitlement that ran through this case was not created by the belief system Chad and Lori built together. That entitlement was already present in both of them. The belief system gave it a name and a justification. They felt entitled to be together. They felt entitled to the financial resources that became available following the deaths of people in their circle. They felt entitled to clear away anyone whose presence stood between them and the life they had decided they were owed. When a person already holds the belief that they operate on a higher level than those around them, and then connects with a partner who constructs an entire theology confirming exactly that, the internal friction that causes most people to stop and reconsider simply stops functioning. Every person who becomes an obstacle gets spiritually categorized. Every difficulty becomes evidence of outside forces working against a chosen mission. The framework carries the weight that a functioning conscience would otherwise carry. Narcissistic features alone do not make a person dangerous. The vast majority of people who carry these traits move through their lives creating friction and difficulty in personal relationships without ever crossing into conduct that draws the attention of law enforcement or a court. But when those features, the inflated self-regard, the entitlement, the inability to register other people's experience as equal in weight to one's own, get wrapped inside a delusional framework and handed to a partner who has both the theological vocabulary and the personal motivation to build a complete belief structure around them, something changes. Every obstacle becomes something the belief system can explain away. Every person standing in the way can be assigned a category that removes the moral weight of what is done to them. Even the people who were closest, even the youngest and most dependent. If this documentary is giving you a fuller account of this case than you have found elsewhere, subscribe right now. Tap the notification bell so you receive the next release directly. There is more still to cover, and the section coming next is where everything examined so far comes together into a single, clear conclusion. 3 diagnoses, hundreds of pages of court records, 2 complete trials, a psychiatric evaluation that the sentencing judge himself read into the record from the bench. Here is what all of that still does not account for. She ran. In the fall of 2019, as investigators in Idaho and Arizona began asking questions about the location of her 2 youngest children, Lori Vallow Daybell did not remain in place. She did not reach out to investigators. She did not make herself available as someone with nothing to conceal. She and Chad Daybell left the country together and traveled to Hawaii. Journalists located them there before law enforcement formally did. Prior to leaving, when Rexburg police conducted a welfare check at her apartment to confirm the children were physically present and safe, Lori told the officer at her door that her son was with a family member in Arizona. That statement was recorded. It was false. A person whose grip on reality has entirely slipped does not make deliberate travel plans, does not prepare answers for law enforcement at the door, does not coordinate a departure. She also did not tell the same story to everyone. This is a detail that the trial record documents with precision. The accounts Lori gave of her children's whereabouts varied depending on who was asking and what that person was likely to know or accept. Neighbors received one version. Family members received another. Investigators received another still. Each account was shaped to fit the person receiving it. That is not disorientation. That is a practiced and deliberate pattern of managing information. Investigators recognized that pattern early and followed it. The inconsistencies between the accounts she gave to different people became part of the evidentiary record that prosecutors built the case around. Then came the trial itself. The framework of spiritual categories, the light and dark souls, the assigned death percentages, the classification of people as spiritually compromised, had been documented across years of text messages, recorded calls, and direct witness testimony. Multiple people who knew Lori and Chad testified about hearing this language used. Multiple communications admitted into evidence showed it being applied in real time to real people during the period in question. At sentencing in July 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell stood and addressed the court. She did not affirm the belief system the evidence had laid out. She told the court the media had constructed a false narrative around her. She said the portrait prosecutors had painted was not who she was. She called on Jesus Christ as the authority over what had truly happened, and said that no one had been taken from this world by another person's choice. She rejected it all, on the record. In the same proceeding where 3 consecutive life sentences were handed down. That sequence, years of documented communications establishing a shared belief system in precise detail, followed by a full public rejection of that system at the moment of maximum legal consequence, is not the pattern of someone who has no awareness of how their conduct appears to the world outside their own framework. It is the pattern of someone who understood exactly what that framework looked like from the outside, and chose the moment it could no longer help them to walk away from it entirely. The prosecution spoke to this directly. In their court arguments, prosecutors stated that there was no evidence Lori Vallow Daybell's conduct had been caused or shaped by her mental health condition. The psychiatric evaluation described a set of conditions. The prosecution's documented position was that those conditions did not account for the choices she made. The specific, deliberate, sequential choices that produced the outcomes the jury had already determined she was responsible for. That statement did not come from outside commentary. It came from the legal team that had spent years examining the evidence, interviewing witnesses, and presenting the case before a jury. The diagnosis describes a condition. It does not explain the choices made inside that condition. That is the distinction that tends to disappear in most coverage of this case. The assumption that because a psychiatric condition exists, it functions as an explanation for the conduct that followed. It does not work that way. A diagnosis describes the internal landscape a person is operating within. It does not erase the record of decisions that person made while standing in that landscape. What the constructed belief system provided was not a set of convictions so total they overrode all rational processing. The evidence suggests it served a more deliberate function. It was the account they maintained for each other and for the people around them. An account with enough internal structure to feel coherent. An account that allowed what they wanted to do to feel like something other than a simple choice, made in the interest of getting what they wanted. When a person decides they want something badly enough, a relationship, a life, the removal of what stands between them and that life, the mind will reach for a framework that permits it. That is not a pattern specific to this case. It appears across the documented record of people who have caused serious harm while maintaining an elaborate internal account of why that harm was necessary or justified. What separated this case was the sophistication of the justification. The theological system Chad and Lori built was detailed enough, internally consistent enough, and reinforced between them over a long enough stretch of time that it became their shared operating reality. Those around them who were drawn into it experienced it as something with real authority, but it was constructed, deliberately, by people who understood what they were building and why. At sentencing, the judge told Lori Vallow Daybell directly, "You knew where your children were. You knew they were gone. You accepted public assistance payments designated for them after you knew they were no longer alive. And you stood in front of every person who was searching, and you said nothing." She heard every word of that. She processed it. And then she said that Jesus Christ knows no one was taken by another person's hand. That moment, that specific response, in that specific setting, is the most precise illustration available of what the psychiatric evaluation captures and what it does not. It captures that she holds to beliefs that resist external evidence, what it cannot capture, and what no clinical document assembled before the full trial record was available could have anticipated, is the degree to which that resistance reflects a decision rather than an inability. Untreated damage does not remain contained. Over time, without intervention, it reshapes the way a person sees themselves, understands others, and decides what they are permitted to do. That is not an excuse for what followed. It is a documented pattern, one that can be identified before it reaches the point of no return. That is what this case leaves on the record. Not only a verdict and a sentence. A documented account of how a person moves from internal wounds to external harm, step by step, over years, with a structure around it sophisticated enough to feel, from the inside, like something that was always meant to happen. It was not. It was a series of choices, made by people who knew, at every step, exactly what they were choosing. If this documentary gave you a clearer understanding of this case, share it with someone who would want to know this story. Subscribe if you have not yet joined this channel. Every person who watches, shares, and engages makes it possible to bring cases like this the kind of coverage they deserve. This has been a complete examination of the psychological evaluation of Lori Vallow Daybell, what the record confirms, what the trial evidence revealed, and where the official account still leaves the most important questions without a final answer. Thank you for watching.